Thank you very much. I will try to pick up the pace a bit. It is truly a pleasure to be here today. I've been working in the field of mitochondrial disease for over a decade, in clinical trials of mitochondrial disease for over a decade. And when our work started many years ago, there really were no other programs for patients with mitochondrial disease, and there had never been before clinical trials really in patients with mitochondrial disease. And what's been an over decade long journey has resulted in a number of really important learnings that I wanted to share with the group today, because we stand at a really exciting point in time now with so much new science, so much exciting science, and so many clinical trials now for people affected by mitochondrial disease, that it's important that we learn the lessons that we've gone through so we can increase the probability of success in the clinical trials that we're running now. I do want to say that it's been an incredible privilege to be able to have been working with the mitochondrial disease community and so many patients, families, and physicians over so many years. Incredibly dedicated group and really a very strong community. And I can see from on the participant tab in Zoom that there's some very familiar faces to me, and I'm grateful for all the relationships that have been formed over the work we've done together over the past decade. Just a word about PTC Therapeutics. We are a global company focused on developing drugs for patients with rare diseases. We were founded over 25 years ago with the explicit mission of using pioneering science to develop drugs for kids and adults who desperately need them. And we've grown quite a bit over the past 25 years and now have over 1,300 team members in 20 offices worldwide. And we're currently selling drugs for different diseases in over 50 countries. We have a very strong and broad portfolio of therapies for rare diseases. We have several that are in the market right now, including therapies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, rare disorders like hATTR amyloidosis, and familial hyperlipidemia, cholesterolemia in Latin America. We also have, from our splicing platform, discovered a drug for SMA currently being marketed by Roche, as well as our gene therapy of Upstaza, which was approved in Europe this summer, which was the first ever gene therapy approved that's directly administered in the brain. And that's a drug that has been developed for kids with the rare disease of AADC deficiency. We do have an entire platform, our BioE platform, which is dedicated to disorders of energy, including mitochondrial disease, and our lead therapy, vatiquinone, which many of you may know as EPI-743 or now PTC-743, is currently in registration-directed trials for 2 different indications, including mitochondrial disease-associated seizures, which is a phase 2/3 global clinical trial, which is now been enrolled for kids with mitochondrial disease and associated seizures, as well as a phase 3 global trial for Friedreich ataxia. We have a number of other programs at different stages of development in our BioE platform. But today, as I said, I want to focus on our lessons that we've learned in developing drugs for kids and adults with mitochondrial disease over the past decade. I'd like to start first with just talking about the ideal disease attributes for drug development. When we think about developing drugs for a specific disease, there's certain things that we really look for that make drug development easier. First, it's very good to have a disease that's homogeneous, where there's shared genotype, phenotype, similar symptoms, and similar rate of progression. It's very important to have robust natural history with well understood disease course from the beginning of the disease to the end stage, including how quickly patients move through the disease course. It's very important to have objective metrics of disease, things that are easily measured and correlate with disease severity. It's also important to have a large number of patients who could meet the criteria for a clinical trial, which allows for rapid and easy enrollment of clinical trials. And it's also very good if there's a precedent for drug approval. If there's been already a path established for how clinical trials should be designed, what should be the endpoints in clinical trials, and also regulatory authorities like the FDA who are familiar with drug development for that specific disease. Well, I think from the discussions today and just from our own experiences, it's pretty clear that mitochondrial disease does not meet these ideal attributes. I think we know that well, and that's in part of what the challenge is in developing a drug for mitochondrial disease. We know that mitochondrial disease is a family of incredibly heterogeneous diseases. We know that two individuals can have the same genotype or maybe the same name syndrome, like Leigh syndrome, but have very different symptoms, very different rate of progression. And that complicates drug development. We also know that there's no established development pathway because we haven't yet had a drug get across the finish line and get approved. So we don't yet have that precedent of exactly how to do drug development. We have some challenges in terms of endpoints. We also don't have a lot of really strong natural history. There's some very nice pieces of literature which give some idea about the progression of mitochondrial disease, but we don't quite have yet the robust natural history that's really needed for drug development. Also, given the fact that we've had so few clinical trials over the years, we don't really have a strong culture yet in the community of clinical trial participation, which means that we need some strong education efforts for both patients and physicians regarding what clinical trials are about, and in particular, this idea that a clinical trials is a lot different than clinical care. And so if you're in a clinical trial, going to a doctor's visit is a little bit different than just going as if you were going for a regular checkup or examination. And of course, what we also know is that while mitochondrial disease as a whole includes a lot of people, each individual syndrome or genetic type can be quite rare, which poses some challenges in terms of enrolling and doing larger clinical studies. So I just wanted to highlight a top 5, if you will, of some key lessons that we've learned over the past decade that I think could be very helpful in our efforts now as a community in getting ready to and also participating in existing clinical trials. First is, appreciate the reality of the challenge. Second, we really do need robust natural history and patient registries. Third, it's really important to understand that drug development of mitochondrial disease is a team sport. It requires strong relationships across all stakeholders. 4, we need to really work hard to develop a culture of clinical trial participation. And finally, when we're doing clinical trials, we need to make sure that we have trials that are designed that are practical, informative in terms of demonstrating that drugs are safe and effective, but also not overly burdensome to patients and investigators. And I'm just going to walk through each of these 5 lessons in a bit more detail. First, appreciate the reality of the challenge. Mitochondrial disease drug development is hard, and there's no getting around that. And I think it's always important then to acknowledge that there's a challenge, and we have to be very sure that we don't believe anyone who's going to say that they have a shortcut or a miracle therapy without testing it. I think this is just an important in terms of setting expectations. We're going to have a lot of trials for mitochondrial disease patients. We're going to have a lot of candidate therapies, and obviously we hope for as many of them to succeed as possible, but it's always important that we understand from the beginning that this is going to be tough, and that the drug development process will have many steps along the way, as Anne alluded to in her presentation. And that means that we may need multiple studies to get a drug approved, and that as we're doing these studies, the way that the studies are designed have to be done in a way to ensure that we're getting the right information around how a drug works and its safety to lead us down that path towards approval. It's also really important that we learn from each other, and for any of my industry colleagues on the conference here, I think we need to learn from each other, which is really important. I think there's often a misconception that companies are competing with each other. We're not. We're all in this together to help get important therapies to people with mitochondrial disease, because I think it's quite clear that we're going to need not just one therapy, not just 2 therapies, but I think given the complexity of mitochondrial disease, we're going to need a lot of therapies, and we're all in this together. Second, robust disease natural history and patient registries are really, really essential to effective drug development. When we design clinical trials, it's so important to have comprehensive natural history that tells us about how symptoms play out over time. What is the rate of progression of certain symptoms? Because these help us understand how long we need to make clinical trials in order to show that a therapy is beneficial. It also helps us understand inclusion criteria, who to include in a trial, because obviously we want to include patients in trials who are most likely to show benefit to our therapies. And also we need to make sure we have the right endpoints. And endpoints are basically the way we tell that a drug is working. So for example, if we were developing a drug for blood pressure, we want to make sure that we're measuring blood pressure. And by way of contrast, if we were developing a drug for diabetes, we may not be as interested in measuring blood pressure, but something relevant to diabetes. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it still holds true. If we're focused, for example, on our study of vatiquinone and mitochondrial disease-associated seizures, obviously we want to make sure we're enrolling patients who have seizures and that we have our endpoints are about seizures, because that's the story we're trying to tell. That's the evidence we're trying to gather in our clinical trial. It's also important to understand in natural history the correlation between genotype and phenotype. That's really important in mitochondrial disease, where there may be differences related based on genotype alone. It's also important to understand, to get long-term longitudinal data about the timing of symptom onset and rate of progression. It's really good to know how long it takes once a symptom appears for it to maybe get worse. That allows us to understand, can we then show in a trial that we're making a symptom better versus what would happen without any treatment, or in other words, what would happen in the natural history of the disease. And finally, as Anne mentioned, registries are incredibly important to help with trial organization, selecting study sites that would be close to where their patients are with a particular disease, and also make it easy to reach out to patients and families to let them know that a clinical trial is happening. And I want to take this opportunity to really give a shout out to CureMito for their incredible work in a short period of time in building the CureMito registry, which now has over 200 data points of 200 patients in the registry in over 32 countries. That's not easy work, and that's an incredible amount of productivity in a very short period of time that will be very, very important to us as we bring clinical trials to mitochondrial disease patients. Next, strong relationships are needed across all stakeholders. As I mentioned earlier, rare disease drug development is a team sport. No one group has a playbook on how to do it right. Not a company, not a doctor, not a patient, not a foundation. We're all in this together. And as we design trials, we need input from everyone, from patients, from doctors, from researchers, so that we're sure we're designing the best trials possible in hopes of getting therapies approved into patients. We have to be united as a community and work together and build each other up and leverage each other's expertise and knowledge and be a unified front, because this is a battle, and it's going to be best won if we're all working together and moving in the right direction. And when we talk about stakeholders, this also includes regulatory authorities like the FDA in the United States and the EMA in Europe, who are also very invested in making sure that safe and effective therapies get to patients. And there's a lot of education that we as a community can provide to the FDA that will be very helpful in their work in helping ensure that we get safe and effective therapies to patients. Fourth, we really need to work to build a culture of clinical trial participation in the community. Culture of clinical trials really help in recruitment for trials, and also for patients and families involved in clinical trials to understand what it means to be a clinical trial participant, and also to understand why clinical trials are important. Without clinical trials, we'll never get drugs approved. And it's also important to realize that clinical trials may or may not benefit someone who participates in them, but they will hopefully in the long run benefit the entire community. It's also important that we have education efforts for all stakeholders. That includes physicians, that includes patients, that includes families. This is all really, really important in getting the community in a strong position to be understanding and ready to participate in clinical studies. One important element is understanding the difference between clinical trial and clinical care, as I mentioned. Why, when you go to the physician's office for a clinical trial, it could be a bit different than when you go for a regular checkup. Also understanding why trials have a specific inclusion criteria, and just because someone, for example, may have a diagnosis of Leigh syndrome, they may not be eligible for a specific trial, and there's usually good reasons for that. It's also important to understand why trials may have placebo phases. That is, you have participants enter a trial, one may get a study drug that could work for the disease, but the other participant may get a placebo. And there's a lot of important reasons why that exists. And that's really a key part of drug development. It's also important to understand that you may go to your local physician in Biloxi, Mississippi, near your house for your mitochondrial disease care. But if you want to be in a clinical trial, you may have to travel to Houston or Atlanta to the nearest study site. That's a reality of clinical trials. And it's really important that people understand that there may be some travel required to participate in a study. It's also important for participants to know that they can also withdraw from a trial at any time. Just because in the beginning you participate, if you wanted to, you actually have that right to withdraw. Now, obviously, we hope that anyone who enters a trial stays in, but it's important to know that you as a participant in a clinical trial have rights. Finally, it's also very important for patients and families to know that there's a lot of important questions to ask before entering clinical trials. Well, for example, if I have to travel from Biloxi to Atlanta, will those costs be reimbursed? Many times in clinical trials, companies like ours will reimburse travel costs so that it makes it easier to participate in the study. And also the other really important question to ask is, if I enter a clinical study and I'm put on placebo, will I ultimately get access to the drug? That's a really important question. Different companies do things differently at different stages of development. In our trials, we've always tried to ensure that participants will get study drug, but it may differ from trial to trial. And I think it's important that we know to ask those kinds of questions as we begin to participate in a clinical study. And the final lesson that I think we've learned is that clinical trials need to be practical, regardless if this is being something developed at a clinical study site, an academic institution, at the NIH, or by a company. There's a number of important considerations that should be taken into account to ensure that trials are practical and can be executed fairly easily. Picking the right duration of a trial. Everyone wants short trials, particularly if there's a placebo group, but sometimes a longer trial is needed to actually get the right answer to the question of whether a drug is safe and effective for mitochondrial disease. Really important in mitochondrial disease is understanding how supplements are dealt with in a clinical trial, because supplement regimens can differ from center to center. And if we're doing international trials, they'll be different from country to country. So there just needs to be a plan to ensure that either there's some uniform approach to supplements, either everyone can stay on their existing supplements, no one's on supplements, either way, or there's many other options. The reality is it's just something that has to be dealt with in organizing a clinical trial. Global trials can be very helpful in increasing the number of potential trial participants. This is one way we can address the fact that in any one country, a specific mitochondrial disease subtype may be quite rare, and to do a good trial, we need more patients. So going to other countries sometimes is very helpful in building up the number of eligible patients. Endpoints need to be practical, measurable, and not overly burdensome. This is important for both patients and investigators in trials. Mitochondrial disease patients have obviously easy fatigability, inability to perform certain tasks, and there's a lot of challenges that are part of being a person affected by mitochondrial disease. And so if we're going to do clinical trials and have assessments, we need to make sure that there are things that can practically be done for patients, and that also we're not asking patients to do so much that we can get tired out and not get a real accurate assessment of whether or not a drug is working. The other thing we've learned, and I think others are realizing now, is that having remote visits using telemedicine should be done whenever possible, so that you reduce the burden of having to travel to study sites, and also any effects that travel could have actually on assessment. So, for example, if you spend a day or so driving several hundred miles to get to a clinical study site, you're going to be very tired. It's going to make it hard then to actually do any kind of testing that is going to help us understand if a drug is effective or not. What you want to do is erase any impact that travel can have on the disease state, so that we can get a really good idea on whether or not the drug is safe and effective for a particular patient. And the last thing that's really, really important is ensuring that we have a stable baseline prior to treatment initiation. Part of being in a clinical trial, one of the benefits is sometimes you get access to a center of excellence for mitochondrial disease, where you'll also get special dietitians and physical and occupational therapists who may not only be important for the trial, but also be able to give some guidance and advice and support to just the care of a patient with mitochondrial disease. And that may change in a good way an individual's condition at any one time. So you want to make sure if there's any changes to care, those happen before starting in a trial, so that we're sure that we're measuring only the drug that's given and not any other changes in care that may happen that may actually ultimately improve how someone's feeling or functioning. So that's a little bit of a quick run through some of the key lessons. There are many others, but I think these are several important ones to bear in mind, because we really are at a very exciting time. I think never before have there been so many therapies in development for patients with mitochondrial disease, so many clinical trials, and as we saw this morning, so many exciting scientific advances that will bring more and more therapies forward over time. I think that over the past decade I've been in this field, I've seen so many important advances. We've made the community is stronger and better connected than ever. We have better registries that are essential to drug development. And while we may have a long way to go, there's been tremendous progress. And indeed, the future is bright for clinical trials and development of therapies for patients with mitochondrial disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr.